the arcade goers wouldn't even dare to whisper his name. 3 letters, a name so simple yet enough to strike fear into a man's heart. AAA, the myth, the legend, the god gamer, the absolute gaming goat, the first one to beat Tetris, the real Pac-Man world record holder, the first one to find the Super Mario Bros. Lost levels, the 101st encounter in the Bloody Palace, the #1 player in every game in every arcade across the world, the final boss of every game's ranked ladder. But who was AAA? Well, obviously he was not a real person. The tale of AAA is one of how human behavior repeats itself regardless of region. A lot of people chose the laziest solution to fill in the 3 letters for their high score. No one had to tell them to hit A 3 times. They did it because it was the easiest solution. And who knows why each individual chose this lazy path. Maybe they prefer to remain anonymous, maybe they didn't even know that they achieved a high score, or maybe they were just used to getting high scores so they couldn't even bother throwing in their initials on the score screen. Regardless, the AAA entry became infamous. Some kids will look at this entry repeating itself across different games in multiple arcades, and even if for a moment believe that there was indeed an absolute unit of a god gamer going around every arcade beating every game and getting records. Others, however, would fully understand that AAA wasn't a real person, but spread rumors of their legend. Some would take up the mantle of AAA by registering their high scores as such. An idea, behavior, and usage that spread from person to person within the arcade culture. AAA became a meme. From the arcades into the internet, the legend of AAA grew, with people adding more and more feats to the name of the god gamer, each getting more absurd than the previous one. However, over time his legend was slowly forgotten, barely talked about anymore. But why? From the 70s until the 90s, arcades were an essential part of gaming. While around the 80s, gaming consoles became extremely popular and allowed people to play video games in their homes, their technology was pretty limited for some games. If you just wanted to play Super Mario World, you would be fine with a SNES. But if you wanted to get good at Street Fighter 2, you had to go to an arcade. Arcades were hollow ground for competitive gaming and acted as early social hubs for people who enjoyed games. Due to their popularity, games were designed around arcade environments and had tough-to-beat CPU-controlled opponents that had input reading capabilities and had the purpose of eating up as many quarters as possible. You might notice this when playing ports of old Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat games, but none of them even come close to SNK's fighting games, which spawned the term SNK syndrome, to denominate incredibly hard final bosses that would eat up thousands of quarters with their cheap moves and input reading techniques. During the 90s, however, a shift started to take place in the gaming scenario. First, consoles were finally catching up with arcade machines in their hardware capabilities. The gap grew smaller and smaller until the Dreamcast was released, and with it came Soul Calibur. Soul Calibur was the first game that was simply better in its home console version than its arcade one. Likewise, games such as Marvel vs. Capcom 2, Capcom vs. SNK 2, Virtua Fighter 3, and Dead or Alive 2 simply ran better on the Dreamcast. Besides games starting to run better on consoles, the rising popularity and affordability of internet services started to shake up the status of arcades as the gaming hubs. Over the course of the 90s, online games grew more and more popular with each passing year, eventually becoming worldwide phenomena with games such as Ultima Online, Quake, Diablo, EverQuest, Warcraft 3, StarCraft, Half-Life, and Counter-Strike being some of the most successful games of all time. With games being much more accessible from home, arcade attendance rates slowly dwindled over the years, with arcades closing doors everywhere. Game developers started to prioritize home consoles and PC releases, trying to optimize online experiences, and now when a game gets an arcade release, it is a surprise. As arcades faded away, the power of the legend of AAA waned. In the late 90s and early 2000s, while arcade culture was still fresh on people's minds, the AAA meme went from the arcade to the internet. One of the earliest internet memes, AAA even got an article on Encyclopedia. Much like in the arcades, people just kept adding crazy achievements to the list of feats of AAA. However, it might not take long until AAA is nearly completely forgotten. Games rarely have top score screens anymore. Top scores were part of the Attract mode that allowed CPU versus CPU game demos that would play on arcade machines to get players to notice the cabinet and beg them to insert a coin to play. The vast majority of games don't even have an Attract mode anymore. Those that do have it purely for legacy reasons. Games now have leaderboards instead, which don't have the 3-letter limits to the name entries. Instead, they show the player's game tags, and these are more about a player's personality rather than anonymity. People name themselves their real name, favorite characters, memes, or even nonsensical words, but always with the intention of being identifiable somehow. High-ranking players in online games would most likely prefer to become well-known and famous rather than having themselves named AAA and never be identified. There's not enough room for mysteries such as the identity of AAA, and that also has to do with how gaming communities changed over the years. If you went to an arcade, you were forced to, in one way or another, interact with other people. Now you probably have to go out of your way to engage with other players, otherwise every player you come across is just another number. Someone that you won't remember in 2 games, and maybe you even tell them to... If you did that in an arcade, however, let's just say that getting punched in the face would be one of the best case scenarios. Arcades, much like anything, had their upsides and downsides. And one of the downsides is that depending on the place that you attended, fights could constantly break out. And even worse, some arcades have some really shady types in them. It is also hard to deny the convenience of playing games at home, not having to wait for your turn, not dealing with the strong smell of nicotine infesting every machine and seat, the sticky and broken buttons, and so on. Arcades weren't for everyone, and that's understandable. Still, there's this weirdly magical nostalgia surrounding them. They weren't perfect by any means, but they felt special. Meeting with friends, playing games, and hanging out in arcades are important memories for a lot of people. AAA was a part of that. He represented the simplicity, the innocence of the arcade days. Someone simply couldn't be bothered to scroll down the ladders, and suddenly speculations rose, fantastical tales were told, and a legend was born. Even though he was not real in a physical form, AAA became real as an idea. He, to this day, is a symbol of the age where arcades were at their apogee. If you liked the video, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment down below. And thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.